Hi makers, I'm Alex with Minerva. Today we're going to be working on a sew-along for Burda's 7400. And makers, I'm going to be doing view B, which has a cuff and gather, kind of like a big pleat at the bottom. But I wanted to show you today's fabric. I'm going to be using this Minerva Exclusive Viscose Challis. It's called Abstract Marbling. Look how fun. It has a lot of drape. And of course, this pattern also asks for rib knit. So I will be using our tubular rib knit in black. All right, makers, without further ado, let's get started. Makers, today we are working on a sew along for Burda 7400. I'm going to be doing view B, which has a pleat on the back leg. Let me show you the pieces that you're going to need. You will need pattern piece number 1, and this is the front, and you're gonna cut 2. You also will need a pattern piece number 2, and this is the back. You're gonna cut 2. You will need the pocket, and this is pattern piece number 3. You're gonna need 4. You're also going to need pattern piece number 4, and this is the waistband. And makers, you need to cut this out of rib knit, only this piece out of rib knit. You're also going to need pattern piece number 5, and this is the cuff since we're doing view B. And makers, you have to cut 4, but you have to make sure that you interface 2 of those, all right? Today, I'm going to be using abstract marbling. This is part of Minerva's exclusive fabrics, and this is a viscose challis, and it has great drape, perfect for this pattern. You can also use a linen or perhaps a lightweight jersey. This pattern also calls for a rib knit fabric for that waistband, and only for the waistband. And I'm using this tubular rib knit in black. And of course, you're going to need matching thread, a twin needle, 1-inch elastic. And makers, don't forget to label your makes. And makers, we are going to be making pants, and I want to make sure to remind you to always make a muslin when you are making pants. I will also go ahead and tag the muslin for this sew along in case you think perhaps I should make a muslin before I make pants. So I will also go ahead and tag this. Makers, now that you cut your fabric, I went ahead and serged my outside seams for piece number 2. This is the back, and also my pockets. This is piece number 3. If you don't have a serger or an overlocker, no problem. Just go ahead and do an overcast stitch on your sewing machine. I went ahead and grabbed my pockets, right? And with right sides together, there's my piece number 3, my back piece. I want you to pin here, and on the sides, you have 2 notches right there. I want to make sure that you stitch 5/8 inch seam allowance from the top of your pocket raw edge all the way to that second notch. And I want you to do that for both back legs, piece number 3. And I also want you to do this for your piece number 1. This is your front pant leg. I want you to do the exact same thing. Go ahead and do a serge, finish your seams, pin your pockets, right sides together, and then go ahead and stitch 5/8 inch seam allowance. Don't forget the back stitch at the start and at the end. Once you do that, I want you to press your pockets towards your seam allowance. Go ahead and do that now, and you have 4 pockets and 4 pieces, 2 for the front and 2 for the back. Go ahead and do that now. I went ahead and stitched my pockets in and I pressed them towards the seam allowance. Makers, now I want you to grab your back piece that you just did and your front piece and put in right sides together. And I want you to stitch from the top of the raw edge to that notch. And I want to make sure that you keep a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So you're going to be stitching on top of that stitch that you just did. And then again, I want you to start right at that notch that you have on the pant and keep going all the way down to your pant leg. Don't forget to backstitch at the start, stop, again, backstitch right there, start again down here at that second notch. Don't forget to lock in your stitches and then keep going all the way down the pant leg. Once you do that, I want you to go ahead and press your seams open. Do not stitch your pockets closed. Go ahead and do that now for both left and right sides. Makers, so I went ahead and stitched those two, the front and the back piece together, and I press my seams open now. I want you to keep this front pocket piece and the back piece separate, and I want you to grab this and take it to your sewing machine, and I want you to stitch, I want you to top stitch as close to the edge from the start of the opening to the end of the opening, and I want you to top stitch only the front pant leg. Once you do that, I want you to grab both of your pocket pieces and I want you to pin them together all the way around, and I want you to stitch 5/8 inch seam allowance starting at the top, going all the way around and stopping right there. Once you do that, I want you to clip your seam allowance for the pocket because we want our pocket to go towards the front, not on the side, towards the front of our pant leg. Once you do that, I want you to go ahead and baste your pocket at the top because again, you want to make sure that it's staying towards the front. Let me show you what that's going to look like. So here's my pocket, right? I closed it. Before I did that, I top stitched it. Again, only the front pocket. Only the pocket towards the front pant leg. I top stitch it. There's my stitching right there. I clipped that seam allowance right here. See my seam allowance? It's clipped on both sides. And then I'm going to baste right here. So go ahead and do that for both pieces that you have. So I went ahead and top stitched my front piece, and then I also stitched around my pocket. I clipped my seam allowance and I moved my pocket towards the front and I basted it in. And now the pattern's asking us to go ahead and stitch the sides together. So I want to make sure that you go ahead and you pin. So makers, I want you to stitch 5/8 inch seam allowance. Don't forget the back stitch at the start and all the way to the end. And let me show you what it's going to look like, right? And once you are done, I want you to go ahead and press your seam allowance open. And if you're asking yourself, this is a little bit different from what I usually do for my pants, you are correct. Remember, the side seam is slightly towards the front versus right on the side. All right, so go ahead and do that now for both pieces. So I went ahead and stitch my inside seam for both pieces. Now I want you to get one right side in one wrong side, and we are going to put one inside the other. And makers, make sure that the front is towards each other, right? You put them again, one inside the other. And what I want you to do, I want you to pin that center front and center back. Of course, make sure that the crotch seam matches. So makers, now I want you to go ahead and pin, and I want you to stitch from the front all the way at the top, all the way down and around the crotch curve and in at the back. I want to make sure that you also use your overlocker or you do an overcast stitch, and I want to make sure that you press your seam to one side. All right, go ahead and do that now. Go ahead and stitch your two pieces together. Go ahead and do that now. Makers, I went ahead and stitched my center front and center back seams, right, by the crotch. And the pattern has you pretty much opening your seam allowance and pressing it. What I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and press your seam allowance to one side. I also want you to finish the raw edges on that center seam. Makers, I also want you to go ahead, take your pattern, your pants to the machine, and I want you to top stitch on that center seam. The pattern does not have you doing that, but remember, these are pants. It's good to just have a little extra secure in there. So go ahead and do that now. Once you do that, I want you to put that off to the side, and I want you to grab your rib knit, and I want you to stitch 5/8 inch seam allowance. Don't forget the back stitch at the start and at the end. This is a knit, so you have to use a zigzag stitch or a narrow zigzag stitch. Go ahead and do that now. So I went ahead and stitched my rib knit. I also pressed that seam open, and makers, where I folded it, I cut a little bit of that rib knit just so I don't get bulk. And then I also left a little opening so I can go ahead and put my elastic through. I also grabbed the pattern and did dots for where the casing stitching has to go. But before you do, you're going to grab your pants, and the pattern has you putting your seams right at the front, right? So you're gonna grab your pants and put them in, and your pants are going to be slightly larger than your pants are gonna be slightly larger. Start at the center front. Remember, we have no side seams. The side seams are towards the side seams are slightly towards the front. So usually when we would do a waistband, we would put these towards the sides, but not in this case. Just go ahead and put them towards the front. Okay, and just pin away. And yes, you're going to have to stretch your rib knit ever so slightly to make sure it goes all the way around. Once you're done pinning, I want you to go ahead and stitch 5/8 inch seam allowance. Don't forget the back stitch at the start and all the way to the end. Once you do that, I also want you to go ahead and stitch that that liner stitching for your casing. So go ahead and do that now. Go ahead and pin your waistband to your pants. Go ahead and do that now. And keep in mind, you're going to have to stretch your waistband, not your pants. Stretch your waistband to fit. And again, don't forget you have to use a narrow zigzag stitch because this is a rib knit. Go ahead and do that now. Makers, I thought I would show you this on my sewing machine. Remember what I told you, your pants are going to be bigger than your waistband. That means that you need to stretch your waistband slightly. And of course, I have my machine set to my lightning bolt stitch. If you don't have that in your machine, you can just do a zigzag stitch. Again, I'm pulling slightly, not a ton, just slightly. Once you're done doing that, I want you to go ahead and stitch again in a narrow zigzag stitch or a lightning bolt stitch because you have to do a casing for your elastic. So I went ahead and did my stitching for the casing, and again, you have to use a narrow zigzag stitch, a lightning bolt stitch. You need to use a stitch for knits because remember, this is going to stretch when you pull it on and off. All right, so now I'm gonna grab my elastic, right? And I have that opening that I left, and I'm just gonna get my elastic through. And guys, this is a bodkin. We have them on the website. They are such a wonderful tool for things like this when you have to pull elastics through a casing. I will tag it along with all the notions, but just go ahead and pull your elastic through. And before you stitch this in, make sure that you try your pants on, make sure that you like the fit. If you want it a little tighter, a little looser, now's your chance. So go ahead and pull that elastic through. Makers, make sure that your waistband is not twisted inside the casing and that is one on top of the other, where it's not like you're sewing it like this. You want to sew it on top of each other. Okay, and I'm just gonna take it to my sewing machine. Right, and I have a zigzag stitch. And then just a couple of times back and forth. And that's it. I'm going to go ahead and cut whatever excess, right, and those loose threads. And then just pull that back in. And this opening, I'm going to go ahead and stitch it by hand, just like it's like they recommend in the pattern. All right, go ahead and make sure that you put in your waistband through the casing, that it's not twisted, and go ahead and stitch that opening. Go ahead and do that now. I went ahead and closed my seam with needle and thread. It was very quick, not even 5 minutes. So now that is looking great, makers, and if you want, you can serge the bottom of your waistband. I went ahead and left mine as is. I definitely want to make sure that you overlock or that you serge your pant fabric, your viscose challis. That can fray when you wash it, but the rib knit would be okay. Or you can also grab your twin needle and do a really nice top stitch on the outside. So that's an option. But now we want to go ahead, and the pattern has us, I'm going to hold off. First off, if you are doing view A, you're going to go ahead and try your pants on and then turn, do a narrow hem, and then they're asking you to top stitch. So again, grab that twin needle, that I tagged, and go ahead and do a really nice row of stitching, and then you're done. But we are not. We are going to do a view B. In Makers, view B has a pleat, and if you look at a pattern, you have a couple of lines. So I have my line right there. I don't know if you can see it, and I have another faint line right there. And what I'm just going to do is I'm going to bring those two lines together, and then it has you also grabbing that seam, right, and just bringing it in. Right? So it's going to look like this. That's what it's going to look like. I'm going to pin it. Right? And this is in the back of the pant leg. Okay? So there's my seam. Right? And you want to, I went ahead and stitched just a little bit from that seam right there. Let me show you. So open up your pant, and I went ahead and stitched those through just a little bit, and then I basted it on that seam allowance. That is, I'm gonna see if you can see it. That's what it looks like, right? And you're bringing in, making the pleat onto that seam. All right, once you do that, go ahead and do that, and make sure that you baste your pleat. All right, go ahead and do that now. Go ahead and do your pleats for both legs of your pants. All right, so now we went ahead and did the pleats, right? That's looking pretty good, and I went ahead and basted my pleat on the seam allowance. So I'm gonna put that off to the side, and I'm gonna grab piece number 5, and you have 4 of them. You have 2 that are interface and 2 that are not. I want you to grab the 2 that are interface, and I want you to go ahead and stitch 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once you do that, I want you to press that open. Go ahead and do that now. So I got my piece number 5, which is that fun cuff, and I want you to go ahead and of course, I want you to match that seam, and I want you to pin all the way around. All right, I want you to go ahead and stitch 5/8 inch all the way around, and it's going to look like this. Once you do that, I want you to go ahead and press, and I want you to press it going down. All right, go ahead and do that now. This is for the interface, piece number 5. Go ahead and do that now. Makers, so I went ahead and attached my cuff with the interfacing, and now I want you to grab the ones that are an interface, and I want you to stitch those the same way that we did the other ones, and go ahead and press them open, right? And with right sides together, I want you to put those inside. Trying to match my seam. So makers, go ahead and stitch 5/8 inch seam allowance. Don't forget the back stitch at the start, and all the way to the end. I went ahead and stitched my cuffs, right? And now I'm going to go ahead and trim my seam allowance. So go ahead and do that for both legs. Once you do that, I want you to turn it in, and I want you to give this a good press. towards the inside. Go ahead and do that now for both legs. Go ahead and trim your seam allowance and give it a really good press. Makers, so I trim my seam allowance and I press it towards the top, right? And then I went ahead and gave my cuffs a really good press. And makers, the pattern, once you do now, go ahead and fold your seam allowance and slip stitch by hand. You can also go ahead and just fold all of this, and you can go ahead and top stitch or stitch in the ditch. Makers, and this is what I'm talking about, top stitching, stitch in the ditch. I want you to go ahead and put your needle right on that seam allowance, and what's happening, it's catching my fabric in the back. So just go slow. So that's stitch in the ditch. And makers, once you do this, you can also do some fun top stitching on the cuff, at the top and at the bottom. Makers, I thought I would show you how to top stitch with a double needle. A couple of things that I want you to keep in mind. You need 2 spools of thread on your machine, and when you thread your machine, you have to make sure that the thread is not twisting anywhere on your machine. Also, another thing to keep in mind, make sure you elongate your stitch length. I'm using 3.5 millimeters, and you loosen up a little bit of the tension on your machine. And when you start stitching, I don't want you to back stitch. I want you to hold your threads, okay? And then just, makers, go slow, right? You have 2 rows of stitches. See, you want to make sure that you do not have to pull those. So you want to go really slow. I'm using the edge of my presser foot as a guide. And I always recommend that if you are top stitching with a double needle, that you grab some scrap fabric and that you test this out before going into your make and doing that there. Makers, once you're all done and you went ahead, I want to make sure that you do not backstitch to finish. I want to make sure that you finish on top of each other, right? Those stitches, and then that you lift your needle and that you go ahead and you cut your threads, that you pull your threads towards the back, and that you tie them by hand. Here's what my top stitching looks like. All right, makers, I hope you enjoyed that sew along. I went ahead and tagged the fabrics, pattern, and notions that I use for this sew along. Don't forget to sign up for a Minerva Craft Club account. You get a discount on all your orders for 12 months. And of course, makers, don't forget to share your make on our website with a free account where you can show your makes, get inspiration, and save any fabrics, patterns, or notions for a later time where you may want to tackle another project. All right, makers, I will see you next time. Bye.